Please welcome back to the stage your host for today, Andrea Catherwood.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. We are very privileged to have so many of the key architects of the Good Friday Agreement with us today and during the week. However, sadly, there are some very influential figures who did so much to work towards ending the conflict who have since passed away. So we're now going to take a little time to reflect on their dedication and commitment in bringing peace to Northern Ireland.
I think that once both sections of the people of Northern Ireland start using their energies to work together instead of quarrelling, I think we will build a very strong society and a very strong economy. Today is Good Friday, and I think for the people of Northern Ireland it will be a very Good Friday.
These figures, a majority of Catholics, a majority of Protestants, a majority of Unionists, a majority of Nationalists. We have got the endorsement that we knew was necessary and well within the range that we knew was necessary too. This gives us a base to go forward on.
This agreement is supported across the whole community and in a majority of both communities. 3-1 have supported it in the referendum. That is a resounding victory for all the people of Northern Ireland.
There is much injustice within our society, and there is much conflict within our society, and unfortunately over the last 25 years there has been much death. I want an end to all of that. I am actually working to bring about an end to all of that on a daily basis.
The agreement speaks for itself. I am complicit in the creation of the agreement. I will defend the agreement. I will, as far as is in me possible, operate the agreement without question and all elements of the agreement, and I have absolutely no compunction in saying that clearly.
I think the important thing is, if the trauma of the past 2 years, with all its indecisions and all of the tedious elements of it, hadn't taken place, we simply wouldn't be here today.
They told me 40 years ago I would have attained to where I did attain. I would have laughed at you. And certainly I've had a good innings, I've made good friends, and I've reconciled a lot of enemies.
Well, so many memories there of those who played such a key role in shaping and embedding the agreement. Now we move on to the second panel, Building Peace, the Parties. This is going to be split into 2 sessions. In a moment, you're going to meet the panellists of the first session, led by our chair, Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, who's served as US Ambassador at the United Nations and as President Bill Clinton's advisor on Northern Ireland. And she's going to be joined by Gerry Adams, President of Sinn Féin for 35 years, and of course a signatory to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Professor Monica McWilliams, a founding member of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition and a delegate at the peace talks leading to the Good Friday Agreement. Mark Durkan, who was a key member of the SDLP's negotiating team in the run-up to the agreement and went on to become Deputy First Minister and leader of the SDLP. And Reg MP, Lord MP, he was a senior negotiator for the Ulster Unionist Party in the peace process, and he was later leader of the party and First Minister. So please join me in giving them all a very warm welcome.
Well, good afternoon and welcome back after that fabulous morning and just such a moving tribute to those who have passed on, but also those who have played such an important role in this historic Good Friday Agreement. We have an exciting 2 panels coming up. The first 45 minutes will include Gerry Adams, former president of Sinn Féin, Professor Monica McWilliams, co-founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, Mark Durkan, former Deputy First Minister and former leader of the SDLP, and Lord Reg MP, the former leader of the UU, the Ulster Unionist Party. So welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being here. Today's theme is reflection, and this afternoon we will reflect on the Good Friday Agreement, not only why it worked, but where is it going. As Senator Mitchell said this morning, let's ask ourselves, how can we all do better now? For me, the Good Friday Agreement worked for 4 key reasons. One, it was the passing of a generation. Those involved in the violence were looking back and saying, I don't want my children to have this life. We can do better. Secondly, inclusion, the role of women in the grassroots. Monica's role in that was key. And the third, the process provided respect for all views. As we heard, Senator Mitchell just listened for hours and hours and months, but everyone felt that their views had been respected, even if they didn't get everything that they wanted. And fourth, 3 capitals involved really made the difference, and the U.S. became the honest broker between the two. They may not trust the governments, but they did trust the President of the United States. And I think the peace has endured for 25 years, which is no small feat, especially for the 200 to 300 people a year who would have been killed had the peace process not moved forward, and the tens of thousands that were not wounded. That is an impressive accomplishment. And yet 25 years on, Stormont is still not up and running. 160 people have been killed since 1998. The society is still divided. Some critical issues remain: the process of truth and reconciliation, justice, civic forum, Bill of Rights, how to involve the parties left out of the original Stormont formula. These are not easy issues. So we'll take a look this afternoon on why the Good Friday Agreement worked, why it held, and where it should go next. So I'll ask each of the panelists one question at first, and then we'll go back and have a second one specifically to each panelist. So let me start with just asking each of you briefly, comment on what was the magic of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. And then looking back with the benefit of 25 years, what's the one thing that you would have done differently, if any? And we'll go in the following order. We'll start with Lord Reg MP, then Mark, then Gerry, then Mo. So, over to you.
Well, I suppose in retrospect, you asked what would you do differently, but before we come to that, I think the atmosphere by the mid-1990s was such that paramilitary organizations were being degraded over time. A lot of them had informers. The population was getting completely fed up. You had effectively a new generation coming up, and they couldn't enjoy a proper lifestyle. They couldn't go out. They were afraid of sending their children out at weekends to enjoy themselves. And there was a weariness had crept in after so many years of violence. And by that stage, we had literally thousands of people had been killed, and many more thousands had been injured. And of course, you had a huge audience then of victims who had to live through all of this. So that, plus the economics of it, I think put a lot of pressure on the political parties and the governments to find a way of doing things differently. And hence, you found that there was pressure brought to bear to have a process. And it wasn't simply the 2 years that George chaired. There was other attempts had been made from the beginning of from the late 80s into the early 90s. So it was a culmination of all of these attempted talks processes that culminated in the election of the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation in 1996, from whose members the talks delegates were actually drawn. So I think that combination of things led to a point where change was required.
Thank you. Mark?
Well, I mean, as already been said this morning, what marked these talks as being different was that they were as inclusive as they were. Also, the agenda was pretty comprehensive. The fact is, when we did spend a lot of time in negotiations talking past each other and talking at each other, defending our different proposals and critiquing what others were saying, there was a point where we realised we couldn't keep talking past each other. We were going to have to come to some sort of agreement. And agreement takes not just mutual engagement, because you can have lots of dialogue and still not agree anything, and we've had a lot of those sessions. It's what takes mutual adjustment for collective advancement. And in our negotiating team, Bridge Rogers chaired our negotiating team, and she would put us through our paces and what we called our homework club, and say, that's all very well, that's a good argument for why we want it, but we still haven't answered various criticisms, we still haven't answered various gaps in our proposals. And so we would have to, as Senator Mitchell said this morning, actually listen to what other people were saying and critiquing and answering that, because we also knew we had agreed as part of the rules of the talks that any agreement was going to have to go to a referendum, north and south. That created a certain realism on all our parts, that we had to have a product that everybody else could stand over, and that there had to be enough in it for everybody else to sell to their electorate. So that was a real realism check, a reality check that we had to factor in. And of course, the fact that it was going to be subject to a referendum, that in turn informed some of our ideas about the institutions. And so the form of elective inclusion that we negotiated into the agreement was partly influenced by the fact that we knew this agreement was going to have to go to a referendum north and south. And if we had come up with a more exclusive form of government, you know, a traditional model of voluntary coalition that would involve the involuntary exclusion of parties, we knew that was going to weaken the likely appeal in a referendum, not just in the north, but probably in the south as well. So we maybe should use a time like this to ask ourselves the question, what were we thinking? And answer it honestly. What were some of the reasons why we thought some of the ideas we did, why we agreed some of the ideas we did, and now, in light of experience, say, do those reasons still stand? Which are the principles and the precepts that absolutely are fundamental, and which are the fixtures and fittings and furniture that maybe need to be adjusted?
And one thing you would have done differently?
I would have been more insistent post-agreement on, there was a mistake made in the legislation. The bill to create the 1998 Act did not translate the agreement's proper provisions in respect of a petition of concern. And when you fussed about that, you were told that you were paying too much attention to detail, you were a detail wonk, etc., etc. And the British government's answer was to just they said they didn't want to do a clunky amendment that would have translated what was in the agreement about petition of concern, which was not a veto. It was simply a trigger mechanism for a special proofing procedure around equality and rights issues. And instead, it was provided for in the legislation as a veto. And then the only adjustment that was made was they said standing orders would make provision for the sort of procedure that was outlined in those relevant paragraphs of the agreement. And just an awful lot of difficulty came from that, the mistranslation of the petition of concern, which was carefully developed between ourselves and John Alderdice in particular to avoid veto and to avoid a tit-for-tat veto, but that's not the way it was translated into legislation, and we suffered big time in the Assembly because of that.
Thank you. Jerry.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy, and thanks to Queen's for hosting this conference, Clonmel Buick, Dave Chigolier. I think that we have to give credit to everyone who played any part at all, small or large, in developing this agreement. But I just wanted to give a sort of a personal narrative. You talked about magic, and if there was magic involved, it came from a man called Father Alex Reid. And Father Alex Reid railed against the establishment view. And the establishment view was defeat the Republicans. This is a matter of criminality. This is a matter of gangsterism. Subdue them, and we get on. That's how they defined peace. And Father Alex had a different view along with Des Wilson. He said peace needs justice. You need to listen to people. People have the right to dignity. People have the right to respect, and so on. A turning point for me was in my private meeting with John Hume, which happened 12 years before the Good Friday Agreement, and I've often wondered how it took so long, 12 years, from we first met at the invitation of Father Alex Reid. And then Mark has mentioned, and it's crucial, that it was an inclusive process. All the parties were invited to it. That hadn't happened before. And the agenda, the CLAR, was quite wide and encompassing of all of the issues from constitutional matters through governance, through rights, and so on. So by the time we get into government buildings, and we'd been blocked on a number of occasions and turned away on a number of occasions, we had a fairly match-fit negotiating team, because we had been negotiating with the Irish government, and Albert Reynolds does not get the credit that he deserves for the role that he played with Irish America, and threw that into the Clinton administration, and yourself, Nancy, and your colleagues, John Hume, and with a back channel into the British government. So the ability of all of the participants to agree, I think, is testimony to them reading the broad popular opinion, which certainly from the broadly nationalist Republican position was, you need to have an alternative way to go forward. So the Good Friday Agreement wasn't a destination. It wasn't an event. It was the beginning of a new journey. It was a new journey which didn't define a destination. And in fact, from the Irish sort of democratic point of view, one of the most important bits of it is that there's now a peaceful way to end English government rule in this island, if that's what the people want, through a referendum, whenever that comes about. So I think that was a significant matter for all of us involved, plus all the other equality issues, particularly, and the rights issues. I think Mark's right about watching the legislation. There were a number of issues which were agreed which went awry because of, deliberately or otherwise, the way the legislation was put together. And I remember George Mitchell saying to myself and Martin McGuinness, and this was towards the end, probably in the Holy Thursday or thereabouts, when he said, look, I have a life, and this isn't it. You have a life, and this is it. So if there were things that we could have done better, it would have been with due regard to the necessity of implementation. There's probably other relatives here, but I just want to recognise Daphne Trimble. I've said this a number of times publicly. I really appreciate the challenge that David met in terms of, and he was well served by Reg and other members of the Ulster Unionist Party, but he wasn't well served by other members of that party. And I got to know him much better, well past the Good Friday Agreement, when we used to meet on a personal basis. So I just want to pay tribute to him, and thank you for the little memoriam video, which also, of course, we regret the passing of Seamus Mallon and of John Hume and Martin McGuinness and the others.
Thank you. We might just ask Mrs. Trimble to stand so we can recognize you. Follow that.
That's reconciliation. That's a piece of magic. That's a real touch. And I hope from this day on we can build on it. So Nancy, the magic we have heard from the people inside. But I want to pay tribute, because this is a day of reflection, and thank you to Queen's for allowing us to do that. I want to pay tribute to the contribution that came from outside, including yourself. Don't get too embarrassed. Because first, the United States. And I'll pay tribute to the women who generally don't get mentioned. Martha Pope isn't able to come with us. She was George Mitchell's Chief of Staff. All of us recognise her as a very special person, like George Mitchell himself. She can't come because she's doing what women do all over the world. She's caring for her father, who's 102 years old. So she's behind in Washington, D.C. She's a wonderful woman, and she keeps in touch with me all the time to find out how the people here are doing. Alongside Martha, I want to talk about two other good friends who I met 2.5 decades ago. And it's been very special this last few days because we've been able to honour them. I first met Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady. Then I met her as Senator. Then I met her as Secretary of State. And now she's Chancellor of this wonderful university. Is that not special? Is that not magic? And I see Milan Verveer here, who's now the Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security at Georgetown. We are the closest of friends. And for me, the magic is friendship. The friendship across the Atlantic that has come time and time again to help us over every crisis, over every hurdle. And I am certain that they are there now for us as we try to put the functioning government back up again. And finally, I'd like to say the morale boost that came also, as we saw last week from President Biden, but from South Africa. And I know that Ralph Mayer is here, and they brought us to South Africa. He drafted the South African Constitution, and we did what George Mitchell asked us to do. Listen, listen, listen. My mother used to say, you've got one mouth and two ears, and use them in that proportion. And so that's what we did in South Africa. And I thank the people from Finland and Canada and as far away who came to this little piece of Northern Ireland, where we were known to be cantankerous, Nancy, from time to time, not all the time. And I would just like to say to Jonathan this morning, who referred to the two communities at war with each other, it's not actually the most perfect analysis. It sounds like we were two tribes at each other. The analysis is bigger than that. And so I want to thank the governments of Great Britain and the governments of Ireland, and most particularly the community leaders of Northern Ireland who were waging and waving peace for years and years. And that was a very special piece of magic. And Mo Mowlam, as you all know, was not only a magician, but her own special touch, which we remembered last night, and brought her magic to it. So those are some of the women that I wanted to pay tribute to. But from inside that room, Yeats, I want to paraphrase just briefly. Out of Ireland we have come. Great hatred, little room, has maimed us from the start. So let's remember that it takes little room, little discussions, little conversations across our differences, and that in the end was the magic.
Thank you very much. One thing you would do differently?
It's like asking what's your favourite book. I would do a few things, but I'm only allowed one. We prioritised the issue of victims, and I'm very pleased the Women's Coalition was there, because I'm often asked, what difference does it make to have women at the table? And many of us had been victims. We had known people who had been killed, people who had been injured. And so we asked for a decent process to be established, that we would remember them and remember their sacrifices. If I had to go back, I would probably make that less of an aspiration and make it more of a guarantee. And it certainly would not be... It would not be the legislative process that we're currently seeing in Westminster. It's funny, isn't it, that the one thing that has united all the parties, and that doesn't happen often in Northern Ireland, is the opposition to this legislation. So let's make it human rights compliant. I just don't say that because I'm the Chief Commissioner, or was, of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. I say it because we need healing, and we need what is in the title of that bill, reconciliation. So if I had to go back, I probably would have said, let's keep the spirit of the agreement moving fast, and let's get proper legacy legislation in place.
Well, thank you all for those comments. I'm now going to go in sort of reverse order and ask you just one specific question, and then if we have time left, we can just have an open exchange between you all before we pass on this panel. Just briefly, coming back to the issue of women and youth, I would like all of you to kind of look at how do you get women and youth to remain engaged in politics and the Good Friday Agreement and understanding the legacy. They are the future. They're still divided. They still have harsh views and are not always looking towards the future as we want them to. But Monica, maybe comment a little bit on the Women's Coalition and how well women are represented in Northern Ireland today. There's few in the parties, as was commented on this morning. What should be happening now to get women back at the table?
Well, it's in the agreement, Nancy. The clause is in the right of women to full and equal political participation. And there's also clauses in that agreement which I would ask young people to look at. I actually have to remind myself at the minute, two of the members of the Youth Parliament, and I'm sure the Youth Parliament are here, reminded me this week that the only reference to the history curriculum at the minute in GCSEs is that women handed out tea and buns when the British Army first arrived. That's only reference to the role of women in this society. So that isn't inclusion, that's exclusion in my book. And I think that their voices are vital voices, and it's really important that we change that. I also think the substance that women bring, the agenda, they broaden the agenda, is really important. And because my time's short, I went to see the play in the Lyric last night, and it was lovely to be sitting beside Sandra Mitchell. Yeah, This Agreement. And the actors are superb, and it's a brilliant drama. But as I walked out, and I asked Don Purvis and others, did they feel the same? It was just that little bit limited. The women, once again, were written out. And something has to be done about that. I pay tribute to our wonderful artists and our poets and our playwrights, who did so much to also help make the peace here. But I think it's only fair, 25 years on, that women get written back in. And so I keep on saying to the women in Northern Ireland who I'm still working with, the peace building never ceases. But I am delighted to say that as I go up to the Assembly and sit in the gallery and look down, once it gets re-established, that there are 36% of women now as politicians, making decisions, debating, and are the current legislators. And so to the next generation, I hope you join them, and that number will rise and rise and rise. That's democracy.
Mark, I think we should pay a little bit of tribute to John Hume's contribution to the Good Friday Agreement. I can still hear his voice saying, it's about people, not territory. What would he be saying today in terms of successes and failures? And he's very much part of this agreement.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the risks about a panel like this of the Farmers' Union is you can end up with a situation that Hugh Logue once described as nostalgia bumping into amnesia on the way back from obscurity. And so John, through everything, John would always say things like, if the underlying problem hasn't changed, the underlying solution hasn't changed. And clearly the underlying solution, fully endorsed by the people of Ireland, North and South, in the joint referendum, which was John's idea, is for the principles and precepts of the Good Friday Agreement. But John also was very clear that each generation was going to have to make its own choices, that it was about creating institutions that would allow us to work together, to build the common ground, work the common ground as he saw it, and then people would have to make decisions and choices according to their best lights, their shared priorities, and their shared purposes. And so I think in a situation like this, John would be pointing to the opportunity that is there. Remember, John was talking about the economy long before anybody else in Northern Ireland politics was talking about the economy. A lot of his discussion in America, even back in the 80s and the 90s, would have been about the economy as well. And so he'd be looking, obviously he would have been fretting about Brexit. I can remember trying to explain what Brexit was to him one day in the home, and he said, how did people vote for that? And I said, they talked about immigration, they talked about taking back control and sovereignty. And he goes, Tories, Tories, Tories. And I said, well, he hasn't lost it entirely. He's absolutely got it. But the fact is, he would be pointing to the opportunity, because that was always this thing of the big picture, what's the opportunity, and what's your responsibility within that. One thing I would just want to say, I don't want people to think that victims were only mentioned at the end in the agreement because the Women's Coalition raised it. In much of the discussion, in many of the exchanges that George Mitchell described this morning, victims were a major part of that, because people were talking about different victims, people were talking about different hurts. A lot of it sounded like upcasting, and people worried, is this trying to blame particular parties or put certain parties in a corner, etc., etc. So inevitably, when it came to the text of the agreement, and this was something that John recognised as well, we were going to have to be forward-looking. So when it came to rights, it was generic and forward-looking in terms of the precepts around rights, rather than a thing that was going to recite all the rights that had been violated in the past and all the grievances that were there. You weren't going to get an agreement on that basis. Similarly, unfortunately, we were able to say less about victims in terms of describing them or describing their experience. And yes, what was in there ended up being patronising, and part of the problem has been that so much of the time since the agreement, we have gone from patronising victims to ghettoising them and not actually addressing legacy in proper terms. But in all of the different initiatives there were, you know, to deal with legacy, like Eames Bradley, like Haas O'Sullivan, whatever, remember, those didn't happen because some parties, and it was different parties at different times, were saying, no, that wasn't right. So we're right to criticise the British government now for the legislation, but collectively, we have some responsibility to take for why we didn't address that issue more constructively earlier. And it's sometimes quoted about John Hume that he's one of the people who said you have to draw a line under the past. John wasn't speaking about victims and their needs when he said that. John was actually saying that to us and to others. Look, you can't spend your time after this agreement upcasting to people that they used to oppose power sharing, or upcasting to somebody else that they didn't believe in the constitutional process or whatever. we have to take the agreement as the starting point for our political relationships from here on. That's what he meant when he said draw a line under the past, not anything to do with forgetting victims and leaving them in forgottenhood in the way it has sadly happened.
Thank you. Reg, as Monica mentioned, we have this Lyric Theatre wonderful play where David Trimble's character was front and center. I hope you've had a chance to see it, Mrs. Trimble. What would he say today about the progress and what is needed to get Stormont up and running today? How would he be approaching that?
Well, first of all, before I answer that question, I would just like to make the point that Monica was talking about women and young people and being involved. They can't very well be involved if the institutions are shut down. So, David got dogs abuse, as you will have known. He was under, I would suspect, Jerry may have a different view, but he was under, I think, more pressure than any other of the party leaders, as was visible at the talks process. So he was fighting on a number of different fronts, but he always had a very clear vision because he thought strategically. Some of those who attacked him most thought tactically, and they were looking for the next few months to the next election, but they didn't look at the big picture in the long term. I think he would have believed our current situation is bad, particularly for unionism. We succeeded in taking a position where the building in which the Assembly is located would have been most closely associated with unionism since the 1932 when it was opened. And yet, ironically, it's not nationalists who are keeping the place shut, it's unionists who are keeping the place shut. So it doesn't make sense. And that, I think, has a long-term implication for it. And I think David would have been most uncomfortable with the prospect that we have no operating thing when you consider we have the worst socio-economic crisis facing families and poverty and cost of living increases, when the Assembly that we elected should be there to help those people at this point in time, which is the most... It's like having a car and keeping it in the garage. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I think that he would have been very uncomfortable with that. And I think the other thing was the way Brexit was negotiated by our own government must be the worst example of statecraft by the United Kingdom, certainly in my lifetime, and maybe in others as well.
Jerry, so I'll give you the last question, and then we'll have just a short conversation among ourselves until time is up in about 15 minutes. Your life has been fighting for republicanism, and the Good Friday Agreement met many of those aspirations. How do you see republicanism going forward, assuming the Good Friday Agreement stays? Look 25 years ahead, and what's your vision, and how should we be preparing for that now?
Okay, Nancy, thanks. Just before I answer that, I just want to read into the record the women members of Sinn Féin's negotiating team. Barbara de Bruyn, Siobhan O'Hanlon, Lucilita Brennock, Rita O'Hare, Michelle Gildernew, Chrissy McCauley, Bridge Kern, Geraldine Crawford, Don Doyle, Dodie McGuinness, and Sue Ramsey. It's a matter of historical fact that among the first Republicans on this island were the Protestant people. And Northern Protestants played a huge part in all of that. And what Irish republicanism is about, essentially, is about citizens' rights and about a citizen-centred society. Now, I want to see an end to English rule on this island. And I hear Reg talking about the current Tory government, and I agree with everything that he says about them. And it's just, I think, a matter of common sense that we can govern ourselves better than anybody from London, govern ourselves better than anyone from outside of this island. So citizen-centred, rights-based, let's start to reimagine the future. You know, we will undoubtedly have a referendum. I don't think it should be a repeat of Brexit. That would be an absolute disaster. I think a start should be made to engage. I understand why unionism tactically won't engage, because they see that as putting their step on the slippery slope. But, you know, on an island this size, with a population this size, it doesn't suit to face away from each other. It suits to work together on health, on mental health, on climate change, on infrastructure, on homelessness, on social and economic deprivation, and on regeneration of the economy, and all of those matters. So I think we're into a phase, given all that we've been through, of gentle persuasion, that those of us who want to see that type of vision becoming reality, listening, proactively listening to those who don't, engaging, being flexible about how we proceed in terms of it. And I would just appeal to my Northern Protestant brothers and sisters to look at their own history, particularly here in the county of Antrim and the county of Down, to the role that patriots, mostly Presbyterian, played, and then when they were chased out of the place, went on to play in the independence struggle in your country, in the USA, and went on to become presidents of that United States of America. So I think it's all there for us to discuss, and I think the most important thing is we can now peacefully disagree. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing. There's nothing wrong with somebody putting forward an opinion and somebody putting forward another opinion. Away, maybe 30 years ago, we were involved in private talks with people from mostly church-type people, mostly middle-class church people. And the first discussion was very bruising, was really difficult. But what persuaded me that there was a difference coming about, now this is 30 years ago, was it wasn't a one-off. They came back, we went back. We continued. We didn't agree on everything. In fact, we didn't agree on a huge amount. But we agreed to keep listening to each other's opinions and trying to get some shape of it. So republicanism, or a citizen-centred society, or one in which everybody can be treated on the basis of equality, I think is within our grasp. It will take time. You don't have to rush at it. Just go at it easy, go at it intelligently, and go at it strategically, but listen as much as speaking.
Thank you very much. We got started a little late, so we're going to wrap up and not have that conversation, but we'll be around for the next few days. I would just sum up the panel with thanks to all the youth who are here. Get involved, make a better future. Get the car out of the garage. Don't be afraid of being the detail wonk. It matters. And remember the importance of that rare thing, common sense. So thank you, Queens. Thank you all for this wonderful panel. And let's give the panelists a round of applause. Thank you, Jerry, Mark.
Nancy, thank you so much for that. A little bit of magic there. A fabulous panel. Thank you all very much indeed. Well, now the second session of Building Peace, the Parties. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to meet our next set of panellists. We've got John Alderdice, Lord Alderdice, former leader of the Alliance Party and currently a Liberal Democrat, member of the House of Lords. We also have Gary McMichael, who was the leader of the Ulster Democratic Party and its chief negotiator during the talks leading to the agreement. In 1998, he founded his addiction charity, ACERT, which is now a leading provider of drug, alcohol and mental health services across Northern Ireland. Dawn Purvis is also on the panel. She's a former leader of the Progressive Unionist Party and a member of the Legislative Assembly, and also a member of the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland. And finally, Ian Paisley Jr. is the Democratic Unionist Party MP for North Antrim. He has been for the past 13 years. And he's also a graduate of Queen's University, where I believe he studied Irish history and politics. Welcome the panel, please.
Well, thank you again, Queens, for this amazing conference, and thank you, Lord Alderdice, Gary McMichael, Dawn Purvis, and Ian Paisley Jr. for joining us for another reflection from a different point of view. We have buses to catch, so this will end promptly at 10 after 3, I'm told, so we'll have a chance to have a good discussion until then. We're going to continue the discussion on the Good Friday Agreement, not only why it worked, but where is it going, what did it work. And I think the Good Friday Agreement worked partly because of the young people and the women, but how do you convince the next generation to get involved and keep the progress going? So I'll ask 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll wrap up at 10 after. And it's the same question that I asked the first panel. Just each of you can comment briefly on what made the magic of the Good Friday Agreement work. What was the sauce together? And with the benefit of the decades, what's the one thing that you would have done differently? We'll start with Ian, then go to Dawn, then Gary, then John, just right down the line. So, Ian, if you'd like to start.
Well, thank you, Nancy Soda Bread, as you're commonly referred to here and loved for. Can I say, yeah, Nancy Soda Bread, just for those who missed. Look, at the outset, can I say a huge thank you to Queen's University for laying this on. They've done a remarkable job. I was coming through the day chatting to some of the staff and all the rest, and most of them have been here since about 4:30, 5 o'clock this morning, and they've shown a major commitment. And it's just not today, it's been weeks in the planning, months in the planning, and certainly I don't think any other institution could have done this, quite frankly, and done it in the decompressed way that we're discussing it and doing it, because this is complex, it's also controversial, it also is divisive, but we've been able to be brought together, and I think most of us got this morning a piece of magic from George Mitchell. I mean, that was remarkable, a masterclass in how to lead, how to construct, how to understand people. Probably a psychologist's dream there today. in terms of what was happening. No, looking at you, John, for that one. So he was very, very remarkable. Look, I'm extremely proud of Northern Ireland. I'm extremely proud of its diverse people. I really want to see this place being a critical success. And that's why, I suppose, we care so passionately and why we do take different views on trying to get the outcome that we think is best for Northern Ireland. It's not, I keep saying, it's not utopia, it's Ulster. It's a divided place. And we have to try and work to heal those divisions. And George, in his contribution, he quoted from The Isle of Innisfree by W.B. Yeats, where he said, "Peace comes dripping slow." And sometimes, yeah, the tap has been turned off. In one of the earlier comments, Jonathan Powell said that, it took 8 years to get this thing to work. And then we had the McGuinness-Paisley moment, where it then bedded in and worked. We've really had 3 periods, I think. The first period has been stop, start, stop, start. We then had the second period where we did have a bedding in, and then the third period where we're now in I suppose, a state of tension again. And I think the thing which marked it out is we had big beasts taking big, courageous decisions, whether you were in the no side, and people dismissed people who were in the no side and said it wasn't a courageous thing to do. It was as equally courageous to take that point of view, to have the alternative point of view. Who was it said that if we're all saying the same thing, we're not actually thinking? We have to have people who have different points of view. And we took a different point of view. We led a campaign, and we lost that campaign. But we're Democrats. And we held coming back into a position where we could renegotiate change, achieve changes under the St Andrews, and get a process up and running again. And I think by our actions, it was proved that our party, through its leader then, my father, and then Peter Robinson, we really bedded in a process and tried to make it work through the big beasts. But we have moved to a very difficult position. And I think that one of the things that I hope that people do is, and as a history graduate, I would say this: learn the mistakes of our history so as we are not destined to repeat the mistakes.
And what's the one thing you do differently?
Well, that's one thing. I would take that moment and say, right, let's really learn from that. I mean, as a DUP, are we remorseful? Are we angry that we were on the no side? No, we're not. We took a position, I think, with integrity. We got changes at St Andrews, which we worked very hard for. And, I mean, remember, the process for 8 years wasn't working. There was the most stop-start moment, constipated moment in politics. And it is unfortunate that the last 6, 7 years have been equally a stop-start. And the trick now is, can we get big beasts back in the field? Can we get decisions working from the bottom up, from the community up? Can we get people engaged? I mean, my community is out of love with the institutions. It's a fact. We can pretend that this thing is all cuddly and we can embrace it. The unionist community that I talk to is out of love with these institutions. And yet these institutions could be the only way to preserve the union. So we've got to work hard at trying to make this thing work better, work smarter. And if people think that's easy, come up and do it.
Okay. Good food for thought there. Don, what was the magic? What made the magic? And with the benefit of decades, what's one thing you might have done differently looking back?
Well, I think, like Ian, we're all praising our alma mater today as Queen's University, doing something special. I'm sure there will all be running about showing our Queen's University badges soon, but I'd just like to pay tribute to Queen's University for recognising the role of women in peace building, the role of women in civic leadership in Northern Ireland society. And I think that brings me to what was the magic about the Good Friday Agreement and the circumstances leading up to the Good Friday Agreement. I think, first off, as a working class woman coming from a loyalist community, it was the ceasefires that created the space for, I think, peace to come about. It was certainly such a relief for me and people within my community that the guns were silent. I think, secondly, then there was the women in the community who'd been working across the community for years and years and years. Their involvement in trade unions and in churches and in business, right across civil society, there was a growing support for peace. There was a growing condemnation of the violence and of the killings, and there was a real hunger for peace. And that groundswell of civic society really helped support the politicians into, one, standing for elections to the agreement, and then staying in those negotiations. So I think that was really, really important. It was an important combination at that time, along with what everyone else has said today, you know. But there was a dynamic at that time that I never seen previously, and I haven't seen since. And it's like the planets aligned and everything came together at once. So I think that was really, really important. I think in terms of the one thing I would do differently, I could probably think of about 10, but I'll go on one again and say you'll only allow me one. I think we shouldn't have walked away after the agreement was signed and started to think about the referendum. I think we should have stayed where we were and thought about an implementation committee, because the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement since 1998 has probably proved most difficult, I think, for all of the parties. I think all of the things that we were promised within the agreement, like the Bill of Rights, like human rights and equality, like economic, social and cultural rights, women's participation, all of those things that we wanted to see, including the Civic Forum. We've seen it for a while, it disappeared. They haven't materialised, and I think had we kept the parties together at that stage to see through the implementation, we probably might be in a better place now. And that's more to do with the relationships and building up those relationships, because I think the difficulties that we see now and that Ian described about the different phases that we've gone through is the changing nature of relationships, or people changing, personnel changing, relationships having to be built up, relationships breaking down. And I think if we had had a continuity of process, that we mightn't be experiencing those difficulties, and that would have been inclusive of all of the voices.
Thank you. What made the magic, and what would you do differently?
It wasn't so much a magic, it was more of a miracle, I think. Some of the things that Don has mentioned there, I mean, I think if there were things that were different that had been the case before. We've come through, 20-odd years at that time of different processes that had happened and it all had failed. And the difference in this process was that, first of all, there was an absence of violence. Because you can't negotiate in the midst of violence. And the opportunity that was created through the ceasefires to give a space for that to happen. And I think a willingness on the part of people across the community to see where this would go. Because, I don't think anyone was going into it with a clear vision of what the end would be. But there was an opportunity and a potential which was there, which had to be grasped. And that it was dealing with the totality of issues. So it wasn't just looking at, what the political settlement or the political outcome would be. It was looking at this from the context of, well, what are all the things that we need to address in order to be able to not just deal with the political question, but to deal with the question of how do we move this beyond conflict. And from our perspective, we were coming into the process very much of the view that we had a view that this was a conflict that could continue for another generation, unless there were people who were willing to look at not just the things that we are not willing to accept, but to explore the things that we are willing to accept, then it's not going to be possible to remove the conflict. It's not going to be possible to find a way to share this territory, because we're never going to blow each other off each part of the island. So, I think that was a unique situation. and the ability to deal with all of those issues in a way which everybody had a fair share of hurt and difficulty to deal with and pain, but there was also a fair share of gain. But within that, to deal with a lot of the core kind of issues. So I think that that's what made it different. And it was also within society. The ceasefires happened at a time when things were getting so bad that no one probably thought that it was going to do anything other than spiral out of control. And so it was stabilised at that point, and I think that there was a huge will, even among those who disagreed, and even among those who were suspicious of what this was all about, and the origins and the intent and all of that. There was a huge goodwill there to embrace a hope that we could achieve something. And as probably everybody involved in this, right up until the very last minute, didn't think it was possible. The miracle part is the fact that, what Senator Mitchell reminded us about earlier, was that we went from a point within a few months where we couldn't agree with what we couldn't agree, to where we actually had a complete and robust agreement partially dealing with all of those issues. So that is a miracle. In terms of the thing that would be different, I think that what we did was that we kicked down the road too many of the peace process issues, the conflict resolution issues, such as how we deal with the legacy of the conflict, such as disarmament. Disarmament wasn't about arms, it was about those who are involved in the conflict being able to convince the other community that they were serious about this, and that this wasn't just a tactic, that this was for real and was for good. And the issue around kind of rights, and all of those protective issues which were about resolving the conflict and providing protection and support and confidence to the communities that we were actually building a future that would be sustainable for them, they should feel safe within and feel protected. And those were all the issues that were kicked down the road. What I think I would do differently, although it wasn't within my power to do it differently, we wouldn't have wasted the year before Good Friday in talking about nonsense. We'd actually have dealt with those issues, and then maybe the relationships could have been developed, which would have given us the trust and the confidence to be able to nail some of those things down. Because we didn't nail them down, is that we tripped over them over the course of the next 10 years.
Thank you. John?
There were a number of things that, for me, made the difference with the Good Friday Agreement. When I first became leader of the Alliance Party in 1987, the general view was that those who were involved in violence weren't up for negotiation. Therefore, what you should do is bring together the so-called constitutional parties, as they were called in those days, Ulster Unionist, DUP, SDLP and Alliance, get an agreement, and the momentum of that agreement would bring the violence to an end in some undisclosed way. And so we tried that, and we tried it a number of times. And I remember when the four parties were negotiating with each other at Parliament buildings, every now and again we'd come to a place where things were just completely stuck. And in that situation, John Hume and Ian Paisley, Jim Molyneux, who was the leader of Ulster Unionists at that time, and myself would get together on our own. No governments, no party officials, no record takers, nothing at all. And we tried to find a way through whatever the problem at the time was. And I remember we got together one day, and John was sitting here, Jim Molyneux was here, Ian Paisley was there, and John said, look, this isn't working. I believe that I need to go and talk to the IRA. And I looked around at Jim Molyneux, who was sitting here, and the blood just drained from his face. He wasn't angry. He just said, well, that's it. There's no hope then. Because he believed that if John did that, then he and Ian couldn't continue to talk with him. And anyway, any agreement he would reach would be completely impossible for unionists. And I went home that night really feeling pretty down about things. I thought, what on earth are we going to do? And I thought, well, look, I know John well enough to know that he's not said this without thinking a lot about it. And there's no way you're going to persuade him out of it. So what we have to do is test his idea to destruction. And so, while I may be critical of it, we've got to go along with this and try to find a way forward. And that fundamentally changed the analysis, because the analysis was no longer get the broad centre together and marginalise extremism. It was we have to give everyone the chance to be involved in the process, given respect, whether you feel like it or not, treating people fairly, whether or not you wanted to, and trying to enable all of us to operate in the democratic process. That changed the analysis, and it changed the whole process. The second thing was leadership. At that time, the zeitgeist right around the world, whether it was Bill Clinton or Mikhail Gorbachev or de Klerk and Mandela, the zeitgeist was you are a leader if you resolve conflict. And so for us, in our little place, in our little way, to be leaders, that's what it was. We had to resolve the conflict. One of the problems of today is that leaders globally feel that they are leaders if they conduct conflict rather than resolve it. So it's a very different... It's a very different and very dangerous world, and one of the responsibilities we have here, which we take for granted, is if we did find a way of stopping the killing, even if we didn't solve all the politics, there's a responsibility to work to understand and to help others to deal with that. What would I do differently? I think I would focus more on implementation. It's been mentioned before, but for me, for example, one of the issues was that we assumed that with agreement politically, with the involvement of Sinn Féin and the Loyalist parties, that the question of the weapons would be, well, the momentum of the agreement would be such that it would just be dealt with. Well, it wasn't. And I spent 7 years with some colleagues on the Independent Monitoring Commission addressing the question of the weapons in the paramilitary organisation. It did not happen automatically. The momentum of the agreement was not enough. There were not enough instruments to ensure its own implementation. And if I was to do it again, I would do that. And it was mentioned in one of the previous panels that one of the places we failed most is on the question of victims. In Colombia, one of the first things that they did was bring in a piece of legislation, not particularly good, but nevertheless brought it in on victims. And I think that we should have been doing that. That's one of the things I think we should have done differently.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have about 5 minutes left. The clock hasn't started ticking yet, but I think it's about to, if you can let me know how much time is left. And what I thought we'd do is just go quickly, give everyone one final minute, and I had slightly different questions for all of you. But they really center around how to get Stormont up and going, how to implement it, but with a slightly different angle. And we'll start with you, John. What is it going to take to get Stormont up and running? And also, how do you deal with the growth of the Alliance Party and others, kind of political groupings, parties, independents, cross communities, that were not given that sort of formula at the beginning? And how do you see that being dealt with? And then just, I think, a minute each, and I think they'll put the time up in a minute here.
Okay. One of the things ending the violence did was give political parties the space to appeal to their fellow citizens with their idea for the future. And in the 25 years since the agreement, I think it's true that nationalists and Republicans have been very successful in doing that. I think Liberals and Progressives, especially in the Alliance Party, have been very successful in doing that, because both of them are looking with a vision to the future that's different, that's new. Unionists have largely been trying to hold on to, sometimes desperately, what they feel they've got or have had. That's not a very attractive vision in a world that's constantly in flux. And so I think you find them feeling increasingly marginalised, and that's a problem that we have to overcome to get Stormont up and running, which, if it is not the case, then Strand 1 can't work, Strand 2 can't work, but Strand 3 is still there, British government and Irish government working together, and that is the default position if the Assembly does not come back into operation. But in terms of engaging with those who have increased their numbers, I do think we need to move away from the notion of parallel consent into a qualified majority voting. Why? Because parallel consent meant that unionist leaders appealed to people in the unionist community, nationalists appealed to people in the nationalist community, and they didn't appeal across the community divide. Qualified majority, that's to say needing 67 to 70%, means you've got to reach across to others outside your own community to get the numbers, to get things through the Assembly. And that's a more constructive dynamic than the one that we've got at the moment.
We were talking earlier about how to move it forward. You had some good thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think that obviously the issue that needs to be dealt with is that the issue of the protocol and the framework and all of those things need to be resolved. You know, that we need an assembly which is going to work. Well, it's not going to work for 6 months. It needs to work for the next 10 years, so that we can actually cement and build the relationships that we need. So the benefits of the 25 years ago Good Friday Agreement can actually reach the community, because we've got communities today, particularly in working class areas, both in Unionist, Loyalist, Nationalist, Republican areas, who are as depraved today as they were 25 years ago. We need, if we're going to solidify this, if we're going to neutralise some of these issues, then people need to be able to feel the benefit. They need to be able to experience about how this has changed their lives and how they can have confidence that the people that they're electing are actually going to lead for them and deliver them with results. The way to do that, I don't know I'm not going to get into this solution to the protocol, but there has to be a solution in order to move beyond that. And the people who are involved in this, in terms of the negotiations around this, need to give it 100% to make that happen as soon as possible. And if that's not working, they need to give it 110%, because that's what we had to do.
Yeah, you're here. Thank you.
I think somebody that's been in my mind this last while has been David Irvine, and he's been, I think, sadly missed by his friends and colleagues, and probably especially his family, but importantly, I think, missed by the process over the last 16 years. And I know, and I don't purport to know what David would be thinking, but I know that he would be, one, very disappointed that working class communities have seen no so-called peace dividend. He would be disappointed that political relationships haven't got to the maturity where we'd hoped they'd be. And he'd be really disappointed that paramilitaries are still in existence, and many of them have turned to drug dealers and criminality. And especially, and I think Senator Mitchell mentioned it this morning about the 100%ers, you know, and David would call them super prods. I think he'd be very dismayed at the super prods that exist within our community, that are determined to wind young people up and lead them down a path that will just end badly for them. But and I know also at the same time, he was a thinker. He'd be on the balcony, he'd be looking down, who's dancing, who's not. He'd be puffing on his pipe, he'd be reciting Rudyard Kipling, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. And he'd be looking for solutions. And he'd be talking to everybody and anybody in order to find those solutions. And one of the things he would talk about is the lack of loyalist voices within the process. And I think if we're serious about being inclusive as we move forward, I was very dismayed to see that the members of the Assembly, the membership was cut from 108 to 90. And I think we need to see that if we want an Assembly that is truly representative and truly inclusive of the society that we have now, then we need to increase that membership, or we need to change the electoral system to allow smaller groups, including those loyalist voices, women's voices, and other people from black and minority ethnic communities to have a say in our future.
Well, I've heard a lot today, and indeed over recent weeks, about, well, the process is broken, we need to change the process, we need to alter this aspect of it, we need to change this bit of it. Fair enough. I mean, if people want to change an agreement which we're being told is a totem, that's up to people to seek those changes. But I would just say very clearly, be careful what we wish for in this, because when you open up one side of it to satisfy some grievance on one side, you automatically start unravelling on another. I mean, to address issues with regards to the Assembly and the function of the Assembly, do we then address issues in reforming the referendum mechanism and wait at majorities in that? Do we open up, what else do we unravel, what else do we open up? So I'm just saying to people, if we do go down that, and I think tomorrow and the next day there's going to be some reflection on this, be very careful what we wish for, because you might end up into another negotiation process which could last a very, very long period of time, whenever maybe resolving the problems around the protocol and Windsor and those issues should be where the focus is placed, and get that fixed first, and that way then keep the institutions and get it running and get people playing their part. I agree wholeheartedly with Dawn's point about the number of Assembly members. I'm for that, and I think it was wrong to have cut it from 108 members when it was that. And I was in that Assembly for that first period of time when we had those members, and it did add dynamic to the process, and that is important. And as I said, we're not Utopia, we're Ulster. We're a divided community, we're different. That difference should be our unique selling point. At the moment, it's our unique stumbling point.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists. I'll just summarize a couple of ideas that I want you to take away. I think the strongest one is we need leaders who solve conflicts and not create them. That would go a long way. The Assembly perhaps needs to shift to reflect the changes over the last 25 years. And a number of you talked about the need to have a peace dividend for feeling the benefits. And I'm just reminded of the theme of President Clinton's 1992 campaign, which was really what it's all about, is putting people first and making sure that they felt they felt respected and that they were having the benefits going. And I will also just close again for the importance of getting youth and women and the inclusion. People who've been in politics for a long time don't change. It's only the next generation. So all of you who are here, if you don't like what you see, get in and change it. It's your problem now. So get involved, and I'm so glad to be at a university where you can send that message. Everyone on these panels has changed the world, changed Northern Ireland, and you can do it as well. Get involved and try and solve these changes and be the big beast that Ian was talking about. And thank you, Queens. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed to all the panel, really interesting. And a special thank you to Ambassador Nancy Soderberg for her brilliant chairing today. We really appreciate it, Nancy. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I just wanted to mention to you briefly that there's a wonderful exhibition at the moment. It's called Peace Heroines, and it's in the Norton Gallery, and it'll be on over the next couple of days. So it's right here at Queen's University. So if you are around for the rest of today and the next 2 days, please do go and have a look. Now, before our final session of the day, we just want to show you a short video about the guarantors of the agreement.
And through it all, these leaders kept their sense of purpose. And in the end, they delivered an agreement that's fair and balanced and offers hope for the people of Northern Ireland.
It's a great opportunity. We are working well as two governments. We are making progress, but obviously there are difficulties we've got to overcome before the final agreement is in place.
Tony and I think, have worked hard on those difficulties to try and resolve them, and I think we can resolve them. There's still some outstanding issues, but in these last days we've had an opportunity to work ourselves through in great detail with it.
The vision and commitment of the participants in the talks has made real the prayers for peace on both sides of the Atlantic and both sides of the peace line.
Well, in just a few minutes' time, we are going to have our final panel session of the day, Guaranteeing Peace, the Guarantors. But before that, I think it's probably just worth reflecting on the fact that when a multi-party negotiation began to try and secure a peaceful end to the Troubles, the Belfast Telegraph gave it less than a 5% chance of success. And many people agree that if it wasn't for the commitment and the determination of the young, dynamic leaders of three countries, the UK, Ireland, and the United States, then the Good Friday Agreement would not have been possible. Now, we have heard today from a lot of people who were involved in that agreement, from people at the grassroots who had been working for years to try to bring peace, and from the constitutional political parties and those who got involved later. We've also heard about those from overseas, from the US particularly, who were involved. And I think that it's worth just thinking about the fact that it was a very, very difficult time for those involved. And actually, it was in 1997 and that two of the prime ministers, the Taoiseach and the Prime Minister, who would later actually sign that agreement, came into office, and both worked extremely hard to make that happen. Now, in a moment, I'm going to invite the Chancellor of Queen's, the former Secretary of State, Hillary R. Clinton, to chair today's panel, because 25 years on, we are lucky enough today to have those three leaders who secured the Good Friday Agreement. We're just waiting for them to arrive. We're hoping that they're going to be here very soon. And rather than listen to me keep going for even longer to try and fill this time, I think we might just pause, and unless you want to hear me actually recite everybody who was involved in the Good Friday Agreement, we might just have to wait just a minute for them to be ready. I think they've been outside. They unveiled, I don't know if you know this, but they unveiled a bust of George Mitchell, and so that's been done today at Queen's University, which is... which I think, bearing in mind what an absolutely amazing ovation he got today, again and again, I think I know that that's something that everybody in the room feels very grateful to him, and I think that that will be something that will be a fitting legacy and tribute to him. But now I am delighted to say, no one more delighted than me, in fact, to say that 25 years on, those three leaders who secured the Good Friday Agreement, Sir Tony Blair, President Bill Clinton, and Professor Bertie Ahern, are joining us now. Please welcome them.
Welcome to the third panel, one entitled Guaranteeing Peace, with the guarantors. And I think you're all aware of who the panelists are, but just in case, we have former Prime Minister Tony Blair, former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, and former President Bill Clinton. And I thought what I might do is to ask each of them a series of questions, but then also, since this is a day devoted to reflecting, ask each of them also to reflect on their experiences. These are all very seasoned political leaders who've had the opportunity to lead their nations. They've confronted all kinds of domestic and international challenges. And so thinking about, from their perspectives, especially for the students who are interested in politics and government, what they now believe and feel reflecting back. But first, we're going to start with, some of the background that led each of them to play the roles that they did in the Good Friday Agreement. And let me start, if I could, Tony, with you. I think it's fair to say that when you became Prime Minister, for many people in the UK, but far beyond the UK, the Northern Ireland troubles had seemed insoluble, that they were really bred in the bone, that there was very little that could make a difference. So what made you, as Prime Minister, coming in with a big agenda, because I remember your first election, there were a lot of things you wanted to do and talked about during the campaign, to believe that there could be some resolution of the troubles and that you wanted to do everything you could to explore that?
First of all, thank you very much indeed for having me here at Queen's, and to be alongside President Clinton and Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, the two people who did so much to help bring the Good Friday Agreement about. And this is my first time ever to be interviewed by you, by the way, so I'm slightly... a little bit.
They're all a little nervous, if you haven't noticed.
Yeah.
Especially the panelists in the middle.
It's the follow-ups that'll get him in trouble.
Well, that's the voice of experience, so I should listen to it. So I think when we came to power, obviously, and it's important to say this, I mean, John Major had tried hard. He'd started a process. John Hewman had been a constant arguer that it was possible. And, I mean, John, I remember, when I was in the House of Commons as the leader of the opposition, and in Parliament, you're going through the voting lobbies, John Hume would wait strategically for me as I was going through the lobbies, and he would back me into a corner. And John was someone who was very persuasive, but there weren't short conversations, right? So, but the thing that he drove home to me the whole time was that it was possible. He said, "I know people will tell you it's impossible. It's possible." And then I was explaining to people earlier my own family background. Obviously, my mother was from Donegal in Ireland, but even though living in the Republic, they'd been a Protestant family, and I'd grown up with the Troubles being very much part of my youth and my own personal history. So I was determined for all sorts of reasons to try to do things. And then, actually, as leader of the opposition, I had met Bertie Ahern, who at that time, I think, Bertie, first time I met you, weren't the Taoiseach. And I also kind of felt, when I had that conversation with Bertie, there was something I felt that could be done. There was we were coming up to the end of the 20th century, or a new millennium. There was a new generation taking charge in various places. Obviously, we were huge fans of what President Clinton and yourself were doing in the US. Everything kind of aligned. And maybe this was just also the fact that we were new in government and, and hadn't had time to become cynical. So we just thought, now let's give this a go. And I remember discussing it with one of my deputy prime minister, John Prescott, who said to me, I don't know why you're doing this. He said, they absolutely hate each other over there, you know. And I said no, I'm going to give it a go. And so we did. Yeah, that's, I felt, and I suppose there always is this moment in time when things seem to come together. And so at least I thought it was worth giving it the best shot.
I think it's also important the role that relationships played. And the story you just told about John Hume really illustrates that. And earlier in one of the panels, Gerry Adams was talking about how he and John Hume began a conversation even, like, I think it was 12 years before the Good Friday Agreement. And, you know, John's genuineness, his authentic spirit and heart were just contagious, weren't they? I mean, you couldn't not listen to John Hume with his passionate belief in the goodness of people and the potential for peace without going away shaking your head, yes, it's possible.
Yeah.
But I also think you referenced the relationship with Bertie Ahern, too. And, you know, as someone who had the benefit of observing all three of you, you really each had a unique political and personal capacity to connect with others. And Bertie particularly had a real skill with that. And so, Bertie, when you became Taoiseach, after having been in politics, obviously having observed what was happening in the North, how did you think about whether there was a path forward?
Well, I suppose the troubles had gone on so long, and all of us, Albert Reynolds before me, John Major, you know, it was just an issue you felt you had to try. And of course, you're meeting all the party leaders, and you know, I was meeting John, meeting Gerry, and meeting all of the political leaders. And I was lucky enough to meet you, President, when you came over in '95. I was leader of the opposition, so I was to get 10 minutes with you up in the ambassador's residence in Phoenix Park, and you gave me an hour. You obviously had nothing to do that day, but anyway. And then I had got to know Tony well, and we had met in Dublin. We'd met in the Gresham Hotel. Was the first time I'd met Tony, and we'd met in both parliaments. So I felt, you know, listen, this was worth it. And Tony had made it very clear he was going to give this a real crack. His first speech, even though he, you know, was huge celebrations coming in as the Labour Prime Minister, you know, huge crowds, and the first thing he did was come to Northern Ireland. So, I mean, he couldn't show more serious intent than that. He went to the Balmoral Agricultural Show. And my job, he has a big farm in Chequers as well. But we got working on it, and I think, you know, we went back and met you, Gerry. The thing was to get the ceasefire back on track and to get moving. So I think from then on, you know, from that summer of '97, all the way up to Good Friday, like it seemed like every day, but it was certainly every week. I hold a record which will never be beaten of the Irish Prime Minister, Irish Taoiseach, that was in number 10 more than anywhere else. I can tell you that. I was there every week, and the food was always good, unlike Castlebuildings. And So I think that's how it got going. So the relationship was good, and of course, President, whenever ever we needed you. Sometimes it said you stayed up all night in the last few days, but the reality was you were there all the time for us, and I think that's how the relationship developed, Hilary.
So, Bill, you also have an interesting pathway to the decision to become so actively involved and working with Tony and Bertie, and eventually asking George Mitchell to serve as your envoy and be deeply involved. Can you give us a sort of timeline, if you will, of how you ended up working with Tony and Bertie and being so committed to trying to resolve the Troubles?
Well, first of all, I think whenever you hear politicians like us talk, you shouldn't discount what we say, but you should try to make sure you got the context right. That is, almost everything you do, particularly if you win an election and you have executive responsibilities, is a combination of something you care about, something people you care about ask you to do, and then you have to figure out how you're going to do it and survive. And all this stuff seems so straightforward today and easy, and it wasn't. I mean, I got interested in this when I came to Oxford in 1968. And the trouble started in 69, and Bernadette Devlin was an attractive young woman who got elected to Parliament, and all the kids liked her. We didn't know jack about this, a lot of us. But it got people thinking about Ireland in a different way. And then all the Troubles happened, and they were happening when I was there. And then over the years when I would go back to the UK or to Ireland, I would keep up. And then when I was running for president, I knew that I had to be up to date on the Irish issue when I went to New York to the primary and when I went to Massachusetts. And this big group in New York asked me to come to a meeting, and my opponents were there, the ones that were left by the time we got to New York. And so it looked like I was going to win the nomination if I didn't screw it up, frankly, then. But there was this big attempt to derail me. And there were people who think, oh, well, you don't want to take any chances. But I had some people working with me and people I'd gotten to know who were part of the Irish community in New York who actually thought I should agree to appoint a special envoy, which then was heresy. That's before there were any peace talks for George Mitchell to mediate. And I got there late one night. Everybody else who was trying to beat me had already put in their best shot. And they asked, and I made up my mind. I said, all right, I'm not going to bring this up, but if they ask, I'm going to tell them the truth. Yes, I will appoint a special envoy. And they told me, I said, you have no idea how hard this is going to be for you to keep this commitment. People will think you're insane. The State Department had operated for decades under a theory that our relationship with the UK was so important we couldn't mess it up. Even President Kennedy in his heralded visit to Ireland did not go to the North and did not talk about it. And, you know, this was one of those things that wasn't done. Well, I thought it was crazy to deny such a large problem's existence and to take a pass when we had the biggest Irish diaspora. We had people who were part of a big Irish population that were pro-unionist, as well as the people that filled the bars and other places in Boston and New York who were Republicans. And so they asked me, would you do this? And I said, yes. And it sounds good, and then you have to do it. So I got elected. And then everybody was telling me why I shouldn't do it. And Nancy Soderberg, who was on the previous panel here, she was on my national security staff. And she and Tony Lake and Sandy Berger they favored naming a special envoy. And everybody else thought I was crazy. The British press was so bad that they were speculating that John Major, I just did it to burn John Major because he checked my passport files for the Bush campaign in '92. I mean, really, like I would change all American policy just to give it. Today, there are people spiteful enough to do that, but I was too dumb to think like that. And and everybody was going nuts. They said, oh my God, Clinton is so pissed off at Major for checking his passport files to see if he tried to give up his citizenship to join the Soviet Union. I mean, go figure. That's the only reason he's doing this. I mean, it was like that's how inconceivable it was to the whole British party politic. And I told John Major, and I respected it. Tony mentioned I respected that Major tried because he was on a very thin parliamentary majority, and he needed the Unionist members of Parliament, and he risked it anyway. And even though, as we pointed out, it didn't really go anywhere, he tried, and I think we should all give him credit for trying. It was easy for, and the Taoiseach at the time, Albert Reynolds, thought I should grant Jerry a visa. And so we all worked it out. There were 7 Irish groups and mostly based in New York City that wanted him to come. And one of them sponsored a conference. They put together a whole speech deal, and he asked for a visa, and we agreed so I could make the United States look like an impartial body, that I would grant the visa for 2 days, but there would be no fundraising. And everybody knew that a lot of money was going into Ireland from the Northeast United States especially, but not on this trip. We were going to send a signal that we wanted to be involved, but we wanted it to be positive, and we wanted to be fair to everybody. And we have 2 people who are members of Congress here now, at least then Richie Neal, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and Marty Meehan, who years ago became president of the University of Massachusetts, but he was there then. And Peter King called me to wish me well right before I left, who became my best Republican supporter because he was from Limerick. And his mother said, if you try to run that president out of office, I'll never speak to you again. So eventually there were certain benefits about it. But at the time it was crazy, they thought. I thought it made all the sense in the world because what we were doing is not working. And it seemed to me, just from the talk, that the public was maybe way ahead of the politicians in their desire to have some sort of resolution of this. So I gave Jerry the visa, and he kept his word, as he always did in dealing with me, and the rest is history. And it brought me closer to Tony, and he was interested. It meant a lot to me because I loved it when he won on his whole campaign platform, was basically consistent with what I believed. And he and Cherie and Hillary and I had an interesting dinner together not long after he became PM. And then I met Bertie, and I thought, Bertie had the kind of BS that I always wished I had. I thought, I want to be Bertie when I grow up. It was great. So we all got along. And that's a big deal if you trust somebody. Because if you make enough decisions under this kind of pressure with all these changing circumstances, some of your decisions will be wrong or will be questioned or will not be good for one of your partners on any given day. It just happens. Nobody's perfect. You can't foresee all this. And the fact that we trusted each other, and we trusted eventually, I think we earned the trust of the parties in Northern Ireland that we were dealing with pretty much across the board, because they thought we would be straight with them. And that's how it happened. And it turned out to be, there were days when I felt like I was a ward politician in Chicago, Hillary's hometown, and there were days I felt like I was taking Seamus Heaney's advice to just take a flying leap and walk on air against your better judgment. But that's how it started. We all just decided that the time was right to do the right thing. There are lots of people here who were involved in this, from all over, including General DeChastelain, who had to oversee the decommissioning of arms, which was highly controversial at the time. People thought we were crazy to think it could ever be done. You remember the first time it brought up? So we were all out here we'd like to tell you that we had it all thought through, but the truth is we made up a lot of it as we went along. We had to wing it. And then when Mitchell came in, he organized our efforts.
Well, again, I think I think the importance of relationships, the importance of building trust, just really are key to everything that happened afterwards. So, Tony, you made this kind of leap of faith that you were going to be committed to doing everything that you could. As you began that effort, what did you have in mind? Where did you think your commitment was going to lead in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, just before I come to that, I should say I was also very grateful to President Clinton, because he was very good to me even when I was leader of the opposition. And in particular, I know you probably don't even remember this, but when I was leader of the opposition, I got the chance to go meet the President of the United States. Now, when you're the leader of the opposition in the UK, you go meet the President of the United States, the visit's got to go well, okay? It's got to go well. So I'm running up to my election, and the President was about to seek re-election in the US. So I go and see him in the Oval Office, right? It's a great thing. And we're sitting there in those two chairs like you do in the Oval Office. And they bring the press in a great scrum, right? So all the press come in. And you know what the British media is like. So you're always a little, what's going to happen? So they come in a big scrum, and someone throws a question to President Clinton. They say, Mr. President, do you think you're sitting alongside the next British Prime Minister? And I completely freeze, because I think, what can he say? Because he can't say yes, because that would be undiplomatic and diss John Major. On the other hand, if he says no, the visit's not gone so well, right? So he says, I just hope he's sitting alongside the next President of the United States. Yeah. And so I always thought, yeah, that guy could do Prime Minister's questions. So when we began this, the first thing we did, and I think this is a really important element for any peace process, is we agreed to talk to everybody. And, in the end, with the peace process in Northern Ireland, I mean, okay, we had difficult jobs to do, but the people who had the really difficult jobs were the politicians in Northern Ireland, because they were taking risks, and they were also having to say to their own supporters, who had built up a narrative over a long period of time, we're going to change strategy, we're going to move, we're going to do things differently. And so, for David Trimble, he had to make, this was a really, really difficult set of decisions he had to take. Seamus Mallon, and then, of course, for Sinn Féin as well. And then you had loyalist groups. So you had a whole range of different people, all of whom were going to have to take difficult decisions to move this process along. And I think the most important thing, starting point for this, is that we were prepared to go and talk to everybody. And I remember, I mean, Jerry will remember this well. I mean, the first meeting I had with Sinn Féin, with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, I mean, at the time, this was, you know, very shocking to people. And you had to be prepared to do it. And I remember after I did it, I don't know whether people any here recall this, I then, after I met them for the first time, I then went to a shopping center for a visit. You know, you meet and then you go for a visit. And I told you about this last night. When I got to the shopping center, I got in there, I was saying hello to people and so on. And then suddenly there was this huge wave of people, including people who are wearing washing up gloves. You know, those plastic washing up gloves? And, you know, the last time I'd ever seen anyone wear this was my mum. And I was kind of, they're all coming together. I was thinking, what's going on here? What sort of protest is it? But this was all to do with the fact that I shouldn't have been shaking hands with Gerry Adams. Because this was a big thing, you see, that the people were saying there was a huge debate. Yes, you can meet them, but you can't shake hands with them. I said, we're going to meet them, we're going to shake hands. Let's just do what you would do one human being to another, and let's see what we can go. We know we disagree about the past, but let's see if we can agree about the future. And, you know, Mo Mowlam then went and visited the Loyalist prisoners in the maze. All of these things were difficult. I don't think anything could have happened unless we were prepared to sit down and talk to people and to understand these conflicts come about because there are two distinct narratives in opposition to each other, and the only way you will ever make peace is if one side understands how the other side feel. They don't have to agree with it. They don't even have to sympathize with it, but at least they have to understand it. And that's what happened.
I think that's a lesson that we should all not only hear but repeat to ourselves and others, because clearly you don't make peace with your friends, you don't make peace with people that you already agree with. You have to keep searching for that common ground. So Bertie, when you realized that there was going to be a serious commitment from the Blair government, and then that the United States, with then President Clinton, would also be engaged, how were you thinking about what needed to happen in order for this to work? Because you had literally lived with it, you've watched it, you knew a lot of the players, and so you had a ringside seat for years, but all of a sudden it looks like it might be real, and you had to figure out what you could do and how you could support it.
Yeah, we got a few lucky breaks, I must say. We decided September 97 that the talks were going to start. And it didn't start too good because the first day we had said, listen, the Mitchell principles, you can't be involved in violence and you can't be in the peace talks. So everyone signed up to the Mitchell principles, and so that was good. So Sinn Féin were coming into the talks. And you'll never guess what happened. The DUP walked out. And but in fairness to Gary McMichael and Don Purtis, who were here, they walked back in with David Trimble. And in fairness to David Trimble, that was a brave move, and I think David Trimble deserves a lot of credit. So we got going, and okay, I think George gave a good explanation today of what happened over those months, and it was up and down and up and down. But I think the two things that Tony and I did, that the talks were as inclusive as we possibly could make them. Everyone was in that wanted to be in, and we continued trying to get everybody in, which we did by St. Andrews. It took us a while, but and then was as comprehensive as possible. And I think all the issues were on the table. Very difficult issues, and issues that I think people thought were impossible to deal with. Decommissioning prisoners, reform of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, changing a lot of the legislation. I mean, there were huge issues, And I keep thinking today, when you look at the issues today, but anyway, we won't get into today's issues, but there were huge, huge issues. And the fact that everybody kept going, in fairness to the parties, I agree totally what, you know, Tony has said about the parties. They had to make their individual breaks. I, of course, knew that the big thing we were going to have to do, because we had the 1937 Constitution, we claimed jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. And Articles 2 and 3 were very special, you know, maybe not to me, but my father, who was an old IRA man, and my mother, who loved Tony Blair but didn't like everybody from that end of the world. And so there were difficult choices, but we all had to do something. And I think that was the issue, that everybody, and it took us time, it took over that winter, autumn, winter into the springtime, but everybody knew they had to make tough decisions. And the reality was that everybody did. And I think that was the great thing about it, Hilary, that people were prepared to say, well, we have our bit to do. The governments are doing their bit. The President of the United States is doing his bit. And if we all do it together, the comprehensive, inclusive process, then it's for the betterment of Northern Ireland. And amazingly, that's how it played out.
You know, this morning, Senator Mitchell said there would not have been a peace process without John Hume, and there would not have been a peace agreement without David Trimble. And I think that, you know, it's really important, especially because they're no longer with us, to remember the roles that each of them played. But every person at the table, everybody involved in the process, I think it's fair to say, was a unique personality and leader, and trying to work through all of their concerns, their personal experiences, their grievances, their hopes. All of that was so difficult, as you said, Bertie, because, you know, it was so inclusive, but by being inclusive, you had to bring everybody literally to the table and then to an agreement. And, you know, Bill, part of what I know you did was to work to develop personal relationships with a lot of the leaders, so that you could call them, they would be invited to Washington for the St. Patrick's Day celebration at the White House, other kinds of events. Could you talk a little bit about how you and George Mitchell discussed managing such a big process, such an inclusive process, and how you build trust with people who start off from such different perspectives?
Well, first, when we started talking about this, and especially after I gave the visa to Jerry, then everybody settled down, and whether they were for it or against it, they said, well, maybe America's serious and we need to be consulted, you know, consulting with them. So I tried to meet with as many as I could, and then we used St. Patrick's Day as an excuse, if you will, the annual White House ceremony, to invite people there and then to either get them to talk to each other or get them to talk to me individually until we could get everybody together. But we tried to find venues in which people would feel comfortable, not embarrassed, and could get cover if they needed it. And I think that's important because, yes, it's important that people talk to each other, but they have to be able to say what they think and outline what the problems are. And one of the things I must say that I had almost no experience with before I got up to my ears in this was multi-party democracies. You know, because we have two main parties in America, and usually if a third party gets going, its main consequence is to screw things up for one of the two main parties, because they can't ever win enough votes in our system to win the White House or win, you know, very few Senate seats or congressional seats or governorships. So I was literally fascinated for years. The whole time I was there, for 8 years, I was fascinated by why people were in what party and what it meant to them. And I found that every single one of them that I talked to had a good reason that went well beyond any kind of personal ambition. That I belong to this party because of A. I belong to that party because of B. And I found it incredibly enlightening. And I found that if we were making headway with some of the parties that may not have had such big numbers, it still affected the chemistry because we had a reputation for listening and trying to respond to problems. But we did a lot because of St. Patrick's Day, and then we did a lot when I went places. And I was talking to Tony and Bertie all the time. And then once in a while, even in the beginning, Mitchell would give me marching orders, and I would salute and do what he asked.
You know, I want to go to that last week, the push, because earlier it was mentioned that both you, Tony, and you, Bertie, actually came to Belfast. Can each of you describe what that last week was like? Because in retrospect, it seems like such a high-wire act, and the fact that it all came together at the end is nothing short of a miracle. But you were both of you, so intensely involved. And take the audience sort of behind the scenes of what those last days were like.
Well, for Bertie, I should say, too, they were particularly difficult personally because you lost your mother, I think, just as the process began, and you came straight back afterwards, which was enormously helpful. I just want to say this about Bertie as well. He had that, it's a great political ability if you have this. I mean, he took lots of abuse during the course of this process. I mean, people would come and be really rude to him. And I get offended on his behalf, but he was never really offended. He would just shrug his shoulders and say, they can say whatever they like. We just got to get the deal done. And it's a really interesting... Anyway, I've always wanted to say publicly, properly, thank you, because it would never have happened without that. So... It was a roller coaster all the way through, but we had, alongside the individual decisions that leaders had to make, we had a framework that people thought was essentially fair, right? And that framework was the principle of consent on the one side, that Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK as long as the majority of people in Northern Ireland wanted it, and on the other side, that there should be fairness and justice, and a recognition that there hadn't been, and therefore the institutions of Northern Ireland had to change. And I think you never get an agreement unless there is, at the heart of it, almost intellectually and politically, something that people think is fair. And the thing about politics that you find is, it's always a battle of reason against unreason. Right? It's always, when you take a step back and you put all the prejudices and all the background and all the history behind you, what is the sensible solution, right? If you can divine that and create it, then the rest is strategy and tactics to get there. And I think that was a very, very important part of it. But also we were, to be absolutely frank, as we carried on during the days and nights, and as George Mitchell was just saying, they were days and nights. I mean, we got a few hours sleep the whole time. Then, frankly, one thing that happened in this was that there came a sort of strange collective spirit that said, at the end of this, we can't go out there and say, anyway, it didn't work. Because the whole of the world's media by then camped outside. And I confess I was starting to get a little bit nervous of the political consequences of failure. But this was a good thing, because it was a spur to carry on working at it. And, as the other thing is that it was up and, I mean, to switch analogies, it was a seesaw the whole time, right? So suddenly one side would be completely against it, and then you had to try and bring the thing back into equilibrium again. Then the other side would be completely against it. And then, I was describing to people earlier how if you were in a room with a group of people and the next meeting was waiting to come in from the other side, I realized after a time you couldn't have them walk out, because if they walked out looking happy, the other people came in sad. So it was a total disaster for the negotiation. So, but the other thing was that you had, it echoes something that Bill was saying a moment ago. You had established the relationship where you could have what I call a strategic conversation, right? So when I was dealing with David or with Jerry and Bertie and I would be sitting there doing a lot of the meetings together, right? So there was no, the British and Irish governments sitting there together was itself an important thing. We were able to have a strategic conversation. By that I mean, they tell you honestly what their problem is, and you try honestly to solve it. Right? And it's a really important thing, because if you can't have that properly frank exchange of where you really are in the whole thing, you can't solve the problem, right? Because people just either stick in their positions or they don't trust you enough to say, look, I know you want me to do this, but I can't. However, I might be able to do that. So you're always looking for that way through. And anyway, for 3 days it was like this. Castle Buildings is, I mean, is it still standing there? Is it still? They should, I mean, it should be a sort of monument to the wrong type of architecture, but it's a... So we were in this terrible building. The facilities were terrible. Everything was absolutely terrible. And then, and every so often, Mo, who always had a sense of humor about these things, every so often when things were really, really grim, she'd say to me, "You're really depressed, aren't you?" And I'd say, "Yeah, I'm really depressed." She said, "Time for the Women's Coalition." Seriously. And then we'd come to the Women's Coalition. I'd say, "Mo, these people are really reasonable." She said, "Okay, that's the future. Now let's get back to the present." So, it was a strange psychology, and in the end, when I had the final call with David Trimble, and I think Bill had also just spoken. He, by the way, I was calling him. I mean, I used to call him, I ignored the time zone, so sometimes I was calling him, it must have been 3 or 4 in the morning, and, they put me through and you say, hi, how are you going? And I used to put down the phone and say to Jonathan, is this guy ever asleep? I mean, it's like 3 in the morning in the US, but anyway, so we had the final call with David Trimble, then we just went for it, but I think it was a combination of many things. But in the end, I come back to the same thing. You can have whatever technical agreement you like, but if the spirit is not sitting alongside it, it will never work.
That is so true. And Bertie, what are your recollections of that intense period?
Well, can I thank Tony for remembering my mum, because that was difficult. But, I think we'd set out that last week, and it was going to be intense. It was going to be, just a huge range of meetings and trying to get people to move a bit and move here and there. And, of course, like everything, you planned the week out and you said, well, some ends of this will be easy and some ends will be difficult, and then by the time you got to Monday you realized you were wrong, everything was difficult, and then you go up and down. I got the call. I also remember my own civil servants rang me when I was coming out of the church when my mother's removal, and they said, listen, we have to talk to you. George Mitchell is losing his hair, and I don't think he had much of it at the time either, but he was definitely fed up with everybody. And he said, listen, Strand 2 has driven the unionists mad, and John Taylor has just said that he wouldn't touch it with a 40-foot barge pole. And he said, you're going to have to get up here. So I said, well, how am I going to get up here? So anyway, we worked it out, and I went for this walk, and George Mitchell, I forgot it. I went for a walk down Griffith Avenue, which is one of the longest streets in Europe. And after at the start of it, George said, "Where are you?" And I said, "In Griffith Avenue." And about an hour and a half later, he said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Still in Griffith Avenue." But at least I went back up early in the morning. I met Tony, and we met in Hillsborough where you got food, as we know last night. Castle Buildings, you got terrible stuff. But anyway, Tony gave me a lovely breakfast. I went and calmed down David Trimble. And the 40-foot pole was put aside. And then I remember going to Jerry and to Martin and explaining to them that I was going to have to move in Strand 2. And then I went to Mark and Seamus and John. And we were okay. We were prepared to move and that. Then I came back to the funeral, back up again. And then we just stayed at it non-stop. But when you look at that, I'm not going to repeat the issues, but the issues were huge. And the issues were huge on your side, Tony. You had to face huge amount of prisoners and, the reform of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. There were huge issues. On the constitutional side, we have it. But I think the big breakthroughs, the trick of it all was that if we could get the constitutional issues off the table, and that was changing the Government of Ireland Act, Section 75, which would really set up Northern Ireland, us taking Articles 2 and 3 off the table, getting the principle of consent on the table, that was the only change. And I think we should always remember that the balance of the agreement is hugely important, because that was the balance, and that still is the balance, which made Northern Ireland different to anywhere else in the United Kingdom, and people should always remember that going forward. That delicate balance, once we achieved that, I found then that, certainly with the Unionists, Mark will remember the late-night meeting with David Trimble, and where Seamus Mallon, I never saw them so emotional when they got Strand 2 out of the way. We didn't have a difficulty with Strand. No, they got Strand 1, then I'd sorted Strand 2. We had no difficulty with Strand 3. And we started making progress. And then, of course, things came up at the end, and Tony Blair had to start writing side letters, and Jonathan Powell put them in under the door because nobody had answered the door. But anyway, at least, and then David Trimble got up on the table to say, "I'm with the agreement." I mean, there were amazing things, but the compromises along the way. But I have to say, Tony is nice to me, but I have to say this to you, Tony. Some of those decisions in the last 36 hours, you were making those on your own, out reference back to your cabinet. There were huge decisions. They brought peace. You had to call them, and there were big calls, and you did a good job on them.
So we're getting toward the end. I personally could go on for a long time, but I think we should stay within the time limits given to us. And so, Bill, I want to start with your recollections of the end. I do remember all those late-night phone calls, and they were pretty constant and always at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, as I recall. But if you could just share, Bill, with as you're thinking about the end, but also then I want to segue, starting with you, as to what advice, if any, would you give to political leaders and active citizens and the people of Northern Ireland right now in terms of moving forward into the next 25 years? And then I'll ask Bertie and end with Tony on that same question.
Well, first of all, the last week was horrible for me because I was so full of anticipation, and I had a day job. And I was so jealous of Tony and Bertie. I felt almost as if Hillary were about to give birth to our second child, and they got to go to the waiting room. And I was kept out. But, George Mitchell would call me, and then Tony would call me, and I'd talk to Bertie, and I'd call whoever I was asked to call. But the thing that I felt always was the process by which all the parties that proceeded, involved so much time, so much effort, and was done with so much respect for people across the political spectrum that I thought in the end that people wouldn't walk away. And it's a great tribute to all of them. Also, there are people we haven't mentioned, Mary McAleese and Michael here. I think the presidency of Ireland, I'm glad Ireland has a symbolic president who can bring people together. And it's a metaphor that they had a president from Northern Ireland. It was great. I don't know, I don't want to get in the way of the program, Hillary, but I think you ought to ask all the people who are here who had any part of that peace business then to stand up, because a lot of them survive and they're here. Is that okay? Would you all stand up? Mark, stand up. Everybody, Jerry, everybody. Let's someone and all the eyes look at this. Thanks. And so I'll yield my time to Tony and Bertie, but the one last thing I want to say is I think the women's groups, the other peace groups, the people who weren't always in the rooms, all those kids that became public figures by the speeches they gave, pleading for people to give them a safe future. I think they had an impact on people. I think every one of us wound up being a little better than we would have been otherwise because we had to look into the eyes of people. And I wish that in every troubled area of the world, there was some way to bring that human dimension in the way it was in the Northern Irish peace process, because it does affect you. There are a lot of these people making decisions, their parents or their children, their brothers, their sisters. That I think it would be a mistake for us to underestimate the power of their influence.
Well, Chancellor Hillary, my one bit of advice, we worked really hard, all of us collectively, and you, President, gave so much time and effort. You came to Northern Ireland, to this island of Ireland, more times than you've been anywhere in the world. And Tony and his governments and successive governments have given huge time and commitment. And between 1998 and the 13th of October 2006, we worked really, really hard to get Democratic Unionist Party on side and to move with us up to that May 2007 when we kind of felt we got our job done. No others had to finish it on. And I just really plead and deeply hope that the Democratic Unionist Party will, pay the reward back to us all to stay the road with us, because the people of Northern Ireland need them. I think the people on this island need them. We all want to work together. The alternatives are not good. We don't even think about them. So let's hope they listen to what George Mitchell said today and listen to what we're saying, that we all just get back on the track. There's too many big things to be dealing with than to be arguing about some detail that was caused over something or another, which I'm not sure what it is even. So, So just let's move forward and try and make this work.
Tony?
I think just very briefly, we know the peace isn't perfect. We know the institutions have often been rocky and unstable as they are today. And we know there's still a lot of distrust and mistrust between the communities. But we also know that Northern Ireland is a much better place than it was before the Good Friday Agreement. And the only thing I would say to today's leaders is, I think when you stand back and you reflect, you know in your heart of hearts what the right thing to do is. And you should just get on and do it.
Thank you so much to our panel ending our day of reflection. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Fantastic finale to the day. Thank you all very much to that wonderful panel. It's been a very emotional and thought-provoking day, but this brings the day to a close. I'm sure you're all leaving with plenty of food for thought, and I hope that you find today's session stimulating and interesting. If you're returning tomorrow, we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you and good evening.